Well, welcome all. Thank you all for being here as we sort of restarting our Georgetown County Library 225th anniversary celebration. Took a little break in July, but we're back and going strong in August, and this will continue through the fall, through September and October. So we're great to have you here. This series is sponsored by SC Humanities. And that's a not-for-profit organization inspiring, engaging, and enriching South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. SC Humanities receives funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and their catchphrase is "Democracy demands wisdom." It's a nice catchphrase, and we'll certainly get plenty of wisdom from our guest today, Dr. Kevin Kokomoor, who earned his doctorate in history from Florida State University. You may notice when he appears, he's got his Floridian print on with his shirt and flip-flops, so he definitely he's carried Florida up to South Carolina. And he's taught at Coastal Carolina University since 2012. And he's a lecturer in the history department there. He focuses on the American Southeast, colonial period, and Native American presence in the Southeast. His book, La Florida, Catholics, Conquistadors, and Other American Origin Stories, just came out the last time he gave a talk. It had not yet come out, but that's from Pineapple Press, 2023. And he's going to draw from that today for his topic. So we're thrilled to have him. Also, he's published a book since his last talk for the library, but Kevin has also published a new edition, a baby as well. So he's had a lot going on, a lot of good things going on since the last time he was here, but we're thrilled to have Dr. Kevin with us today, so please welcome him in.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back around. Last talk I gave was in Pawleys, and we're in Georgetown, so this is a coastal community. This works. So hopefully, you know, I am originally from Florida. I came here in 2012, been here ever since, and I work with, you have another talk coming up, I think later this month, by Madison Cates, who is also a Coastal Carolina. Together, we teach on Southern Studies, and he's much more modern than I am. I'm much earlier. I like the colonial stuff, early American Revolution, early Republic, stuff like that. This is really my Floridian southeastern side here, and I published this in 2023. This was a project of 2019 and 2021 coming and going. I originally thought that I was going to get it published by 2021 because that was the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving. And, you know, completely historically sort of problematic if you ask me, because the first Thanksgiving happened in Florida 50 years later, right? And so that's the opening of this book. The closing of this book is 1619, which is basically the beginning of slavery in the English Southeast, because that's the first sale of Africans to Point Comfort in Virginia, which really sets off basically the plantation system in the Southeast. And I said, that's great, but you know, slavery already existed in Florida for 50 years, almost 100 years actually, right? And so all of these, this book is about basically putting early Florida, and by Florida, I mean the early Southeast, back on the map of American history, if that makes sense. It's the Spanish contribution, and I do like to say that the Spanish contribution is not synonymous with a positive thing. As I make clear in the book, that the Spanish contribution is colonialism, it is the slave trade, it is the Columbian Exchange, it is depopulation and demographic loss by Native Americans. It is a really complex, in a lot of ways, really brutal story. But it is also a story that you can actually see in a lot of places. You can see it in Florida, orange trees, brought by the Spanish, right? Barbecue, cows, pigs. It's all brought by the Spanish. The history of the Southeast would look a lot different if you didn't have this early Spanish thread, which is really the idea of this book. So in honor, I have a section. It's a very large, sprawling sort of idea. And I'll recap this later, but it starts with connections, and then it goes to origin stories, and then it goes to transformations, and then it goes to legacy. So it covers everything from what connected the Southeast to happenings elsewhere, and then it moves to how that transforms the Southeast, and transforms the Southeast is a euphemism for the demographic collapse of the Southeast. And then legacies, what you see around you that has basically its origin story in the Southeast, or has connections to the Spanish Southeast, like oranges, right? Again, when Florida rolls off the tongue, I mean, it's orange juice, right? So I end with legacies. Some of it's lighthearted, some of it is very academic in nature, but I wanna stress that La Florida is not the peninsula of Florida. La Florida is Spain's claim to the modern North American continent. So when I mean La Florida, I mean right here. This was a Spanish claim right where we are right now. And so even though the book, I don't want to try to go over all of the stuff that the book does. Instead, I want to go over something that has a very, very close connection to where we are right now and sort of bring this idea home right here to Georgetown and the Winyah Bay and the Waccamaw Neck. And so the origins of the colonial Southeast is a La Florida story, right? The larger Southeast. So I don't want to go too far back. I don't want to talk about world history, but this is an idea of connections. And a lot of world history really is a product of, or a lot of history, a lot of colonial history, a lot of empire. It's a product of basically this thing that we call the age of exploration, which is the opening up of markets. Feudalism is on the way out. Capitalism is on the way in. The movers and the shakers are not people who own land. They're the people who make trade connections. They are the people who run businesses. And the trade connections here are key to the success of the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, the Royal Africa Company, the Virginia Company. They are all looking for the easiest way to get here. This is where all the good opium is. And if you don't think that's important, the British fight wars for 100 years over opium. This is where the silk is, right? The Silk Road. This is where, so everyone is trying to get here. The traditional Silk Road goes this way. Spain and Portugal are on the very, very end of what you would call the Silk Road. I mean, geographically, they're at the very, very end. They are always going to be losers in the international trade that goes from east to west. You can just look at a map and see that. Who's going to be the winner? Why is it called the Italian Renaissance? Who controls the Mediterranean? The Italians, the Genoans, the Venetians. They become the bankers of the world. They become the financiers of the world. They control the Mediterranean trade. They are the gateway of the Silk Road. So what do the Spaniards and the Portuguese, what do they say? We can't compete with that. So we're going to find a new way around. We are going to push the limits of our navigation. We are going to basically start designing ships that we think can get us across the horizon and back. Ships get deeper, they get wider. They go from galleons, they go from basically galleys, which have oars, to galleons, which are, they have triangular sails, lateen rig sails. They can switch back and forth and ride along the coast, but they have these new, basically huge top sails and square rig sails that you're not nimble. It's a cargo ship, right? So the Spanish galleon, the carrack, this is all Spanish technology. The early astrolabes, the early charts, this is all technology to get you over here. It's got nothing to do with that, right? But when you're bebopping down the coast of West Africa, trying to get to the Indian Ocean, which Vasco da Gama does, and the Portuguese Empire is huge because of this, what happens is you start discovering these Atlantic islands. And when you discover these Atlantic islands, voila, you discover a current system and a wind system. And again, what I'm trying to get at here is what brings Europeans to this side of the world. It's an accident, right? Obviously, we know that. Columbus sails the ocean. He doesn't know what he's doing. He thinks that he's going to get all the way around the world. He doesn't, we don't think the world is flat. We know it's sort of roundish. He thinks it's much smaller in circumference. He thinks he can just sail from there to there. We know that he would have died like a third of the way before you would have gotten there. But what happens is when you get out here to the Canary Islands, what you unlock is a world system. And the world system is the same world system that people have to use for the next 200 years until you put engines in ships, right? You have to use this system. Now, there is an equatorial current as well that goes like a big loop right there, and it goes like a big loop right there. But in addition to the equatorial current, you have trade winds. You have trade winds that push west, and you have westerlies that come back east, and you can manipulate these. Equatorial current, trade winds. By the way, I made it a point to add this stuff. This right here is hurricane history to North America for the last couple hundred years. And how many people have lived here in the past 10 years? How many people have lived here for 5 years? Does everybody remember 2016, 2018, 2021, right? If we go back in time and say this is South Carolina storm history, right? This is Hurricane Matthew. That was a bad one. A lot of flooding in Conway, right? Or how about Florence? Does everybody see what's going on here? Hurricanes take the same route, right? The hurricanes develop off the Canary Islands, right? This is the route of the trade winds and the equatorial current. Those black lines represent Columbus's crossings. Don't you see the similarity there? He's riding the same winds and the same current systems that hurricanes ride, right? Once you get to the Canary Islands and you push off here and you take a right instead of a left, you're going to hit the Bahamas, whether you are alive or dead on that boat, right? It's going to happen. It's going to go very slowly, and if you don't have favorable winds, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, but it will happen. You will get there. The winds and the currents, right? They will take you there. So if you were to look up like a high school atlas of the age of exploration, this is why all those names are Portuguese and Spanish. Because the English were not doing this. The French were not doing this. The Italians could care less about this because they had that. These are the empires that said, it's got nothing to do with this. They want to go that way, and they do go that way. But Columbus goes this way, and he hitches a ride on the same world current system and trade wind system that we still loathe in the 21st century. We can't stop it. As soon as August and September and October, it's like they're loaded up one after another because of the hot water, and they're taking the winds this way, the exact same way a ship would have done it, whether you know it or not. So that gets us to right about here. So his first landing is in the Bahamas, and I don't have, if I had my laptop and I had like an actual mouse, we could play around with Google Maps. I do this in class. If you look up Google Maps and you zoom in right here, it's like San Salvador Island in the lower eastern Bahamas, almost where it's like the Caicos, the Turks, and it's so real low. But did I do that? It's all right. Oh, nice. That's fine. Right here is, it sticks out like a thumb. And if you zoom in to San Salvador Island, it says this is where Columbus landed, right? So he lands right there, and then he lands down here on the second travel and the second journey. And the second journey, he's ready to stay for good. And this becomes sort of Boomtown, this island. It's like the wild, wild west of the Caribbean, 1490s. Now we know it as Haiti to the western side, the DR on the eastern side, it's known at the time as Hispaniola. And on the south side, you have Fortaleza Zama, which protects the harbor in Santo Domingo. And on the north side, you have Puerto Plata. And there's Santo Domingo, there's Puerto Plata. And if you were to look at with some of these old forts, doesn't that just look like something out of that is not a modern fort. That is a straight up fortress out of the death of the feudalist period. I mean, that's like almost pre-gunfire, if that makes sense, right? You stop building forts like that when you have cannon. Or this is where you barely have cannon. And so these forts, and the natives certainly don't have it, so you can get away with old school turrets like that. But from this, you have the expansion of the Southeast. I mean, of the Spanish Caribbean. And I like to ask, and this is where, I'll plug some people in my classes or anyone. I mean, when was the last time you traveled to South Florida? When you look at Miami, does Miami give you the vibe that you are in the southern extension of the South? When you go to Miami, you don't get a southern feel. When you go to Miami, it's very clear that you're in the northern extension of the Caribbean. Miami is a world city because it's a gateway to the Caribbean. And that makes sense by looking at a map like this. The southeastern United States is the Caribbean. It's part of this system. Right, so the connections here are incredible. This is all because the Spanish want to get somewhere else. We've been taught that. Now we know how it actually happens. We know that it was fated to happen, right? You will get there whether you know what you're doing or not, right? When you figure this out, this becomes a highway. It becomes a highway up the East Coast, through the Caribbean, out to the Outer Banks, and you shoot right out. And back to the Azores, and back to across the Atlantic back home. Now, it breaks down into lots of little component currents. The Caribbean current bounces along the Southern Caribbean, the Antilles current are on the top, you have the loop current right here, everything combines into the Gulf Stream current, and that is like, I like to joke, I-95. Which shoots right up the East Coast. It really does, right up the East Coast, right till you get to the Outer Banks. And that's why the Outer Banks is a triangle, because one current hits another current, and they basically jet you right out. And so there's the Gulf Stream. So you get the Spanish sort of, use the term that you want, conquest, subjugation, destruction of the Caribbean islands, then what they call terra firma, then Central America, right? It all, once you land there and that becomes the hub, what else are you going to find? You're going to unlock these regional current systems. And so you have all these, the Mexican current, that's how you get to San Juan y Ulúa, which is now Veracruz. That's where you load down with gold and silver. And this is the system that we'll use. By the way, this is also another sort of natural disaster map that I used for our own benefit. Everybody remember that one? The Deepwater Horizon? The triangles on the top are oil rigs, and that sort of map shows you that what happens off the coast of Louisiana doesn't just impact the coast of Louisiana, because when that oil pushes off into the loop current, then all of a sudden you start finding it on the east coast of Florida. And you're like, oh, how does that happen? Because it hitches a ride on through the Florida Straits, and it becomes the Bahamian Channel, it becomes the Gulf Stream. And again, if you were to look up Google Maps, and if you were to do a topographic map of this, that stretch right there is like 90 miles, that stretch is like 30 miles, and it drops down to 1,000 feet, and then up to 0 feet, just like that. And the water has carved like just a fire hose into the ground, because all of the currents of the Atlantic go through the Caribbean and then leave right outside that. And so what in the world does this have to do with where we are right now? Right? How do we bring this back to South Carolina? This is where this gets dark. This is where that's all fantastic and it's geography and everything, but now we bring in the human component, the imperial and the colonial component. Why would someone want South Carolina, right? And so we have two examples that I give you. One, my people, the Floridian example. And then second, also my people, the South Carolinian example. It just happens to be, this is why I write this book, because I can connect with this. And I say, Florida and South Carolina, one is one of the most famous Spanish quote-unquote explorers. And the second is someone you probably have never heard of, even though you live here now, right? The first one is Juan Ponce de Leon. Juan Ponce de Leon is in search of the fountain of youth, which I will tell you, there's an entire chapter in this book, is a complete and utter lie, right? There is no myth more central to a Floridian's identity than the fountain of youth, and it is an absolute myth. It never existed. He never talked about it. He didn't care about it. No one ever talked about it for 200 years until after his death, right? It's a publicity stunt. What we do know is that he arrives on Hispaniola with the incoming governor, Nicolas de Ovando, in like 1502, like first wave. He goes from the Hispaniola to Puerto Rico. He is a multiple encomendero, which means he owns several encomiendas. Then you have Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón also arrives on Hispaniola with Nicolás de Ovando, and he also becomes an encomendero. Is anyone familiar with Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón? This is where this should start to ring a bell a little bit. First off, you have the idea of the encomienda. It's the New World's first unfree labor, AKA slavery. It's a Native American, right? The Atlantic slave trade is only started by the Spanish after they obliterate the native populations of all of these islands. The encomienda system basically means you get allotted a piece of land, which is supposed to entice you over, and you are allotted that piece of land, and you are able to make wealth on that piece of land using the native population of that piece of land, which means you own the native people as well. You are supposed to instruct them on you're supposed to instruct them on the faith and Christianize them, but what happens in theory, you guard them, you maybe use them to make money, but you also instruct them in the faith. What happens in reality is you have your first gold mines, encomienda. In the Caribbean, you have your first sugar plantations. That's Jamaica. That's the encomienda. Forcing natives to make you money. And what that means is that over the course of the first 50 years of Hispaniola's history after colonization, goes from 500,000 people in 1493 to 500 people in 1548. That is extinction-level demographic collapse. That is what happens to the native population of the Taino and Arawak that lived on Hispaniola, is that they are, through exploitation and disease, right? It's not one or the other. We know that it's not just disease, and we know it certainly couldn't be exploitation alone, but they work hand in hand. And that island is basically depopulated. Same with Puerto Rico, same with Cuba. And so here is where we start to draw the similarity. Both of these guys are encomenderos on these islands. These are the ones running cattle ranches and sugar plantations and pearl diving operations and pig ranches. These are the ones making money, trying to mine gold. These are encomenderos. These are the guys that are supposed to do this, but in reality do this. These two guys are two of many. Now, Hispaniola, and then Puerto Rico, then Jamaica, then Cuba, one after another, falls and falls and falls. Every one of them is depopulated. What comes next? Right? We know that Juan Ponce de Leon sails through what we call the Lucayos. Hispaniola, through the Lucayos, to the east coast of Florida, right? I will show you a 1530, so it's not exactly a primary source, but it's pretty much a primary source, right? Here's 1530s. And again, you probably can't read this. I can almost not read this. It is stated, so here's talking about the Lucayos. By the way, the Lucayos are the Bahamas, right? It is stated that these islands formerly abounded in various products which constituted their riches. I say formerly, for they are now deserted, as I shall later show, right? The difference being that the Lucayos were formerly very populous, while now they are deserted. The reason for this is that large numbers of the wretched islanders were transported to the gold mines of Hispaniola and Fernandina when the native inhabitants there were exterminated, exhausted by disease and famine, as well as by excessive labor. 1,200,000 of them disappeared. What this guy, Peter Martyr, is saying in 1530 is that Spaniards found absolutely nothing of value in the Lucayos. Think about it. Has anybody been to the Bahamas? It's incredibly beautiful. It's sandy. Everything that you think of the 21st century as beautiful, a Spaniard would have found godforsaken, because you can't plant anything on that. That is useless. There's no fresh water around there. The Lucayos are a wasteland, except for what? Except for its native population. What Peter Martyr said is that these guys came up here and they systematically depopulated every single island in the Bahamas until there is not a single person left in the entire island chain of the Bahamas, to ship them back to Hispaniola, where they will die on sugar plantations. Now, you put two and two together and say Juan Ponce de Leon is a rancher on Hispaniola. He has systematically gone through the Bahamas. He goes Bahamian Island, Bahamian Island, Bahamian Island, Bahamian Island. Once you get to the very, very top, we'll call it maybe Andros or Abacos, those top Bahamian islands. What's the next island? Florida. Florida's the next island. Now, if I was to tell you why Florida boosters, if I was to ask you, why did Florida boosters come up with the Fountain of Youth story? What is the real story of Florida's discovery? Why did Juan Ponce de Leon care about Florida? He wants the people there, right? Now, I am making a little bit of an assumption here, but I'm going to go back to that primary source I just showed you. He is there for the people, right? He's a slave raider and a plantation owner. You go from here, La Florida, up to the land of Vasquez de Ayllón, our second example. And we do the same thing, same source. Some Spaniards, anxious as hunters pursuing wild beasts through the mountains and swamps to capture the Indians of the archipelago, the Bahamas, embarked on 2 ships built at the cost of 7 ships. They sailed from Puerto de Plata, situated on the north coast of Hispaniola, and laid their course towards the Lucayas. 3 years have passed then, and it is only the now, blah, 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 I speak of this expedition. The Spaniards visited all the Lucayas, but without finding the plunder, for their neighbors had already explored the archipelago and systematically depopulated it. Not wishing to expose themselves to ridicule by returning to Hispaniola empty-handed, they continued their course towards the north. They were driven by a sudden tempest which lasted 2 days to within sight of a lofty promontory which we will later describe. Who were those 2 ships? Those 2 ships, we know, were Pedro de Cayo and Francisco Gordillo. They were slave raiders. They were hired by Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón in 1521. They cruise through every single island in the Bahamas and they don't find a single person. And they're like, we can't go back empty-handed, so we're gonna keep sailing on. And you have Juan Ponce de Leon takes a left there, and what does that primary source say? They go north. And when they go north, where do they land? Here. Right here. Right here. Winyah Bay. 1521. Right? He likes it. By the way, if I was to turn the page, and I didn't, unfortunately, the rest of that story is he snatches up 60 Chicora Indians from the coast of South Carolina, and they are never seen again. The first time anyone ever sets foot in South Carolina, it's a slave raid, and it is successful. And it is so successful that Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón gets official permission from the king to settle here. Now, this is where I said I was going to bring up my Spanish, because my Spanish is decent, but my 16th century Spanish is not, because they change. It's like half Spanish, half Latin. R's are J's and R's are X's, and it's pretty intense stuff. But, right, on that map, which goes to about the 1640s, which would have been after his failed San Miguel de Guadalupe expedition in 1526, it says, and again, I have my crib sheet here, but still, I mean, I made it, but, right, it says, basically, here came to populate the lawyer Ion, who left from Santo Domingo or Puerto Plata. See the P and the O, that's Puerto, that's how they shorten stuff. Instead of P-U-E-R-T-O, they go P, hypertext O. So who left from either Santo Domingo or Puerto de Plata, remember those 2 images I showed you, these are like the Wild West outposts, right, for moving through the Caribbean, and disembarked his men, but they filled Llanaro, they sent too few men to maintain the land. Right? They sent too few men to retain the land when came invierno, winter, and venido invierno, and they had frio, very cold, and morio, M-U-R-I-O, and it killed many of the men. So what he's basically saying, and we don't have a whole lot of documentation for this. We got a lot more than this, but on the map it basically said, this is the land of of Ion. He came here with too few men. Winter came, it was too cold. He died, a lot of them died, and they left and went back to Hispaniola. That is the settlement of San Miguel de Guadalupe. San Miguel de Guadalupe had a mass. It had a church. And so now you're rattling off your head, what came before that? Maybe Juan Ponce de Leon came before that in the 1520s, but now you're talking about the first church in North America. Now you're talking about the first mass in North America, right? He brought African slaves with him from Santo Domingo. They built half the place. And then one night, and we literally have this in about 2 sentences, he said, of their own accord, they burned the place down. So not only do you have the history of slavery coming to South Carolina for the first time, you have the first slave rebellion, revolt, and you know that once they burned that place to the ground, they were not getting back on that ship to go to Santo Domingo. They fled into the woods, and they were maroons, which is a term for basically runaway slaves who run up into the mountains and basically live a semi-autonomous life outside of the institution of slavery. It only existed, it exists in the Caribbean islands. Jamaica is known for it. It existed in Florida. Florida is known for it. The Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia had a huge maroon population. And now you're talking about all of these firsts. We know that one of the guys that survived, there's a statue to him in Santo Domingo, Fray Antonio de Montesinos. He was there. So we know there was a friar there. He wanted to evangelize the natives. All of these crazy firsts. I mean, we know they happened. You know, we know that also, why can we discount this as not like an absolute concrete first? Is because San Miguel de Guadalupe failed, right? It's a failed colony. It's not the first, even though it is, they are the first, but they're not really the first because it's not there anymore, right? However, do you know where more Spaniards came? And the first church, Nombre de Dios, the first Thanksgiving, the first Mass, the first birth of an enslaved person, of enslaved parents, which would make the transition from African history to African American history. St. Augustine, also Spanish. It's only about 20 years after this, right? So even if this, you can explain away as some crazy blip on the radar that you can forget about, all of these firsts, what happened later is that Pedro Menendez de Aveles comes and he found St. Augustine, and they're still there. Right? St. Augustine never went away. That's 1565, 1564, 1565. You're talking Jamestown was in 1607, so that's 52 years before Jamestown. That's 80 years before Plymouth, right? So, this place, what you're looking at right here is a French map. There we are right here. It's contested by the French. They develop a fortress just to the south of here called Santa Elena. They call it Charles Fort. The Spanish call it Santa Elena. That's Paris Island, right? This history is all over the place. It surrounds us. So I offer all of this. By the way, just to conclude our hurricane thing, the Spanish try to settle right here again, a little bit further south in Santa Elena, and they try to settle Pensacola. And they do it because this route is so dangerous because of all the storms that they want to build a settlement there and build a road between them so that they can just basically cut off the whole Florida Strait. So a guy by the name of Tristan de Luna y Ariano lands there in 1559 with like a dozen ships, 1,000 people. And he lands there in September. Why was that a dumb decision? What is he immediately shellacked by? A major hurricane, right? Wrecks like 3 of his ships. We found them. It doesn't kill everybody, but they're like, well, another failed one, right? Another failed expedition. This area is so important to the Spanish because of stuff that's happening somewhere else, I guess is the point, right? Is that, there is gold being minted there, there's silver being minted there, it's packed on ships that have to go over there. They're going aground, they're getting hit by hurricanes all the time, and the Spanish go, we gotta stay here, right? Because there's just gold all over the place, all over the ground. So, what I just described to you, I'm starting to wrap it up. What I just described to you is right about there. The connections. What do I mean by that? What connects South Carolina's history to Spanish colonial history? When you think those two, that's not what immediately flows off your tongue, is that South Carolina's Spanish colonial history. But it is, Spanish colonial history. right? What does, the history of slave rebellions, you think of South Carolina, absolutely, but you think of Stono, 1749, or 1739. Well, this was 1520, 120 years before that. 220 years before that. I'm trying to do the math in my head real quick, right? And so, you have all these really interesting firsts. Does that totally remake the entire history of the United States? Obviously not, but it does offer some really good complexity, right? These are important colonizing moments and powers, and I mean important, again, not in a triumphalistic way, right? This is devastating stuff. I just said that basically Florida and South Carolina owe their basically discovery to Spaniards because of slavery, indigenous slavery, and depopulation. That would go right here, right? But that is something that touches to the very, it is tied very closely to this region. It is a very interesting first. But by the way, no one has ever really found where San Miguel de Guadalupe is. We look for it pretty much every once in a while. Some think it's down in Tamyaki at Winyah Bay. Something is further south and off the coast of Georgia. But they made their houses out of palmetto logs. They don't stand up for very long once you have abandoned them. Same reason we can't find all the missions that existed up the coast of Georgia. They built really beautiful missions out in New Mexico and California and Texas using adobe and brick. They built it here using palmetto, right? Those will always be there. These won't, right? So all we find is post holes and burial pits and garbage mounds, right? It's a lot harder to do your archaeology on the East Coast, which is why we haven't found San Miguel de Guadalupe yet. Probably never will, but it was here. So I offer all of these as it's written to sort of, it is academic in nature. I won't say that it doesn't have footnotes. It's got footnotes, but it is academic in nature. It's supposed to basically get you thinking a little bit differently about the early history of the American Southeast. Right? Not entirely to poke holes in your Thanksgiving story, but it's more complicated than that, right? That's a very, even the Winyah Bay story is very, very complicated. So at this point, I don't know if we're doing any, if anyone has any questions, I'd be thrilled to answer them. This is a book, it came out in 2023, so, obviously I would be appreciated if you bought it in any way whatsoever, but I have a couple here with me. If you want to purchase them, I can sign up for you. Otherwise, does anybody have any questions? I'll be hanging out afterwards. Yes?
Can you speak to the export of indigenous slaves? Did that start with the Spanish explorers, or was that come later?
That is a very significant portion of the book. It's not a very significant portion, it is in the book. I don't have a map that makes that obvious, but yes, the answer would be absolutely. The export of indigenous slaves, we refer to as the Indian slave trade, was basically the port of Charleston exported about 54,000 people between the years of about 1680 and about 1715, which is when the Yamasee War basically stopped it. And what the Charlestonians, I would say South Carolinians or Carolinians, but it's really just out of Charleston, they are coming from a Caribbean system. They have Caribbean connections. They are cutthroat businessmen here to make money in any way they can. And they originally trade for natives for deer skins. And it takes about 100 deer skins to get you a gun. And because they have connections down on sugar plantations, this is before the Atlantic slave trade really even exists for the English. They are in a huge labor boom and a labor crunch. And indentured servants aren't really cutting it in 1650 anymore. And so what these Charlestonians say to the natives is, we know that you have this retributive way of fighting with all these natives around you who are not the same thing. And we know that you usually torture the men to death and you capture the women and the children and you integrate them into the tribe. Instead of doing that, sell them to me. It takes 100 deerskins to get you one gun. One young man would get you 2 guns, right? And so what the Charlestonians do is they come in and they offer up a market in human beings for trade in the Atlantic world. And that kicks off what we call as the Indian slave trade. And one Native American group like the Westo, the Charlestonians will go to the Westos and say, no one else has guns, here's 100 guns, do what you do best. And when the Westos get too powerful, they go to a competing group called the Yamasee and they say, here's 100 guns. I'm gonna stop selling guns to the Westos. They scare me because they become too powerful. And what do they tell the Yamasee to do? destroy the Westo. And what they do is have one native group prey on another native group until you have this incredible pan-Indian movement come together called the Yamasee War, where natives basically burn South Carolina to the ground and say no longer. In the meantime, to tie back to the Spanish play a huge role in this as the victims of this. The Spanish don't sell guns to the natives. The Spanish want the natives to be farmers and good Christians. The Spanish collect the natives around missions, which make for really easy targets for the Westos. The South Carolinians give guns to the Westos, and you know where they immediately go? Down into Florida, where they destroy the native population of Florida, right? So out of the 54,000 natives that are captured and shipped out of Charleston down into the Caribbean, a majority of them come from Spanish Florida because they are easy targets. The Mission District outside of Tallahassee is called San Luis de Apalachee. It is devastated in one raid in 1704. 5,000 people are captured alone because they don't have guns and the Spanish can't protect them. And the Indian and the natives like the Creeks or the Yamasees backed by the South Carolinians, they have guns. You can't, we have reports from Thomas Nairn, who's a trader. He says he parked his canoe down here, got all the way down here, got all the way down here, and he found Calusas trying to fight them with stone-tipped arrows because they don't have access to guns, right? And they basically annihilate the entire, that's the beginning of a story that I push. That becomes transformations. The story ends with legacies because some of those Creeks that get paid by the Carolinians to raid into Florida, they do such a good job devastating the center of Florida that there are literally no human beings left in Florida for about 50 or 60 years. Those same Creeks come back in about 1730, 1740, and you know what they see running around all over the place? Just white-tailed deer like you could just throw a rock and hit them because there's no one hunting them anymore. And you know what those Creeks do? They don't go home. They stay there. This is where Gainesville is now. It's called the Alachua Prairie. Alachua was a Spanish ranch that was devastated by the Creeks. Well, the Creeks like it so much because the white-tailed deer are so thick there and the Spanish horses and the Spanish cows are so thick there, they go there and they never come back. In about the 1750s, a unique native identity starts to come into being. They are Creeks. They are lower Creeks. They come from Ocheesee Creek. I mean, they are Creek Indians who take on a new name. The new name are the Runaways. Those that camp at a distance, AKA Seminoles. Seminole Indians are Creeks. So you see how there's like a trajectory here, right? They so thoroughly devastate Central Florida that there's nothing left. Since there's nothing left, it's actually a really great place to live, so they move in permanently. So when you think of the natives of the Southeast, and you think of Creeks and Cherokees and Chickasaws and Choctaws as particularly Seminoles, that's the second round of the indigenous history of the Southeast. The first round of the indigenous Southeast would be the Mississippians, would be the Timucua, the Appalachee, the Wally, the Ocala. They're gone. They are destroyed. They are absolutely slaved into non-existence, right? Or in disease. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
They play a central role in that story. They are the losers in that story. It's largely, I don't want to say it's anyone's fault for being enslaved, but what you see is two basically worldviews happen. The South Carolinians go to the Creeks and say, we don't care about anything. You don't care if you're a Christian. We don't want to Christianize you. We want you to make us money. And that creates a really powerful, really scary Native American group called the Creeks. And then you come down to Florida and the Spaniards are like, we don't want you to hunt. We want you to farm. We don't want you to be violent. We'll be violent. We want you to grow corn. And when one group meets the other group, it's not much of a contest. And that becomes really ugly. Excellent question. It's a great plug. That's like the whole third of the book. It's the second third of the book. Anybody else? Well, I appreciate the time, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Dan, very much for this my second time.
Thank y'all, and thanks so much to Kevin again, and we'll be back here tomorrow. Hope y'all join us again, 4 o'clock for John Lane, who's an environmentalist writer who's going to be talking about gators, all about gators. So the celebration continues, but again, let's give one more round of applause for
Thank you very much.